Hello there. Welcome to Full Press, a media criticism podcast here at the Hub where listeners can escape the mainstream media for a precious 40 minutes every 2 weeks on Thursday. I'm Harrison Lowman, managing editor of the Hub, and as always, I'm joined by Tara Henley here in studio and Peter all the way on the other side of the country in Alberta, Mr. Peter Menzies. Thank you very much, you two, for joining us. This is our third episode, and we also want to thank the some 10,000 people who joined us 2 weeks ago, which I think we were very delightful to see those numbers, and we thank everyone from across the country and maybe in other countries as well for joining us. Peter, how are things over there? It has been negative 10 degrees plus here for multiple days. We are miserable. We are trudging through the streets in massive snowsuits. How are things over in Calgary?
Well, I'll see your minus 10 and I'll raise it by 15 to minus 25, minus 26 regularly overnight. The coldest first 2 weeks in Calgary in 50 years.
Really?
It said on the news the other day, and if it said it on the news, it must be true. So, yeah, it gets really miserable like this time of year. Like it's very dry too, right? So like my knuckles are all just done.
Oh, gosh.
I have to like cover myself in moisturizing cream every night before
Peter,
I
what?
go to bed, and it's just disgusting.
Every episode seems to be about your skincare regime. So it's fun that we have that segment off the top. Tara, how are you doing? How's the weather treating you?
Well, it's important, and I try to spa too. So
I agree. I am also moisturizing like a mad woman. I don't particularly like the winter, and I'm starting to count down now till the end of April when we get our last snow.
Okay, let's jump into block one here. I call this segment CEO Tears Will Not Save the CBC. CBC's new CEO, Marie-Philippe Bouchard, was interviewed by Matt Galloway on The Current a couple days ago. This was her big reveal, right? We've been waiting for the next CEO of the CBC to come out of the gate and give us a sense of what her big plan is, what her tonal shift is, the departure from the last CEO, which just objectively, she had she struggled, and people went after her for CEO bonuses, etc. So this was her big moment. Peter, how did she do on that interview?
I thought it was very disappointing. I mean, she spoke like a long-term employee, which she has been, and she spoke as if she was completely unaware of the difficulties facing the CBC. It's sort of this sort of thing goes round and round and round. It's almost like a public service exercise entity where it just endures, right? Like leaders come and go, but the place has its own mass, its own momentum, and it really doesnjust matter who the boss is because it just kind of goes where it wants to go.
She is a 20-year veteran.
I was really really disappointed that there was no sort of, I'm here, I'm taking the bull by the horns, I'm in charge, I'm going to make some changes, I'm going to do this, like that. When you're in that position, you really want to, send a message early. And she did, but it wasn't a very inspiring one. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, she's a 29-year veteran, specifically on the French side, Radio-Canada. In terms of good things she said, I think she talked about investing in local reporting. We need to be close where people live, bring a Canadian point of view. But to your point, Peter, I just feel, and Tara, I suspect will feel the same way, she did not address criticism head on in terms of bias or challenges against the CBC. She talked about misinformation and disinformation, which I find to be sort of buzzwords and are in sort of the eye of the beholder at this point. And she also cried at the end. Sort of what message, Tara, do you think she sent, with all those things she mentioned there?
I also found that interview very disappointing for a number of reasons. I think a lot of people who would like to see the CBC survive and thrive have had high hopes about the changeover at the top. What I would have liked to see Ms. Bouchard do is come out swinging, come out strong and address the criticisms that are readily available in the Canadian public to see and understand, and in parts of the media as well. But she didn't do that. And in particular, the conversation around executive bonuses was very disappointing. This is such an easy issue for them to get a hold of, and yet they cannot seem to do it. There's so much anger in the Canadian public about this. It cuts across political parties. Some people in the CBC's own staff are very angry about it. You saw Matt Galloway push on that issue in particular, and there's good reason for that. But she just didn't commit at all, and I can't understand why.
Well, okay, just for some background here, $3.3 million in bonuses awarded to 45 CBC Radio Canada executives. This is one thing I noticed too. I don't know if you noticed this, Tar, is that she mentions this report coming out of McGill, which looked at the CBC and surveyed, I think it was a couple thousand Canadians, but their views in the CBC.
2,055.
Oh my gosh, there we go. Look at the numbers we have on this show. The results, which are repeated throughout media and which were repeated in this interview, are 78% of Canadians would like to see the public broadcaster continue. However, they forget to mention the second part. You're calling out people for disinformation and misinformation. This is the second part of that sentence. If CBC addressed its major criticisms which weren't discussed in that interview, Peter, what are the major criticisms for you at this point that you feel she should have brought up during the interview?
Well, I think the way that it's become centralized is one. On the French side, if you turn on Radio Canada or watch it in Edmonton these days, all you'd find out about is everything that happened in Montreal today. So it's not national; it's Quebec. And there's an issue there that needs to be addressed. On the other side, it's the issue of bias, the issue of sort of having gone totally woke. Its own culture that I think came across in that interview is that they simply it's not like they won't change, it's like they can't, because they cannot see outside the box that they live in.
The lack of self-awareness
and the misinformation and disinformation. It's like me saying there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, which is why I don't have an Order of Canada. And I didn't get a King's Coronation Medal, and I'm not praised wisely all the time. It's just silly to that extent. You can't just call your critics people who are misinformed about the beauty and wonder of the CBC.
It's a losing strategy. I think that's so clear. It's just a losing strategy. They need a better one.
Tar, you recently did a talk a few days ago for the Digital Media at a Crossroads conference. And you raised some of your criticisms about the CBC. You also talked about solutions. Can you give us a taste of what that talk looked like and what the reaction was like?
Yeah, I just wanted to draw attention to what it would take, practically speaking, to save the CBC at this point. And I think there's an enormous gap between what the CBC thinks it would take and what the public thinks, and particularly conservative voters think it would take. And I was trying to just bridge that gap a little bit. So I looked at the major criticisms. Bias is definitely one of them. It's interesting. I hear from a lot of Canadians on this issue. The vast majority of Canadians that I hear from do not think that the CBC bosses or the Liberal government are handing down editorial diktats from on high. That's not what they think is going on. And most people don't even think that individual journalists are, with some exceptions, individual journalists are partisan actors that are trying to manipulate coverage. They don't think that. They think the CBC exists in an ideological bubble, and as such, it is ignorant of and hostile to ideas that it finds foreign to its dominant worldview. That's certainly what I think as well. But there's other major criticisms as well. There have been mistakes in coverage. I hear this from people all the time that have not been gone back and been corrected. The pandemic coverage in particular is something people talk to me a lot about. And you can see this in the CBC's own documents from its ombudsman during 2021-2022. There was a 60% increase in complaints that year from the public. There's also the issue of executive bonuses. We've just touched on that. There, according to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, since 2015, The number of people at the corporation receiving over $100,000 a year in salary has gone up 231%. We know that the VPs from Blacklock's reporting, Blacklock's reporter reporting, that's a mouthful, but I'm going to try say it. But anyways, from their reporting, we also know that the VPs make almost $500,000 a year. The public just really doesn't like this. This is a public national broadcaster. So, and the other issue that, Peter has talked a lot about in the past, and that we hear from fellow colleagues in the media and independents and startups and even legacy media, is that the CBC is using its $1.4 billion advantage to compete with struggling media. So those are the major criticisms. That's what I would like to hear a response to. And then I had a bunch of suggestions.
Give us two of those.
One of them would be, this is the simplest thing. It would be so easy to execute and not expensive. Have lunch and learns for CBC employees to expose them to other ideas, particularly on contentious issues.
You and I talked about even like having a debating club where they're, forced to take the side of an issue they don't necessarily agree with, and then they have to defend it to sort of just, that exposure. We sound like we're treating them like kids here, but
no, then we'll say this every time. There's lots of exceptional journalists there. We know that.
Peter, just before we move to our next section, any recommendations in terms of changes the CBC can make immediately to better its chances? I know that, it really is a life and death situation for the CBC, and I still am not sure that the CEO understands this. She gave this sort of mealy-mouthed answer, it is to some extent an existential threat. When is something to some extent an existential threat? It is or it isn't. Peter, what can they do to avoid that threat a little bit?
I don't think they can do anything anymore. Like, I've lost patience. I've tried to be kind of a friend. Like, I've tried to stick up for them and say they can fix this and they can fix that. Well, of course you can, but they don't want to. I mean, the thing that comes across to me constantly is they don't want to change. They like being what they are, and they will resist anybody's attempt to change it. And, the dictates don't come down from on high. They form a little bit organically, but in terms of management's influence, it's who gets an atta girl, who gets an atta boy, that sort of stuff, and who gets the promotions. That's how it works internally with cultures like that. But I've pretty much reached the end of my trail. Like, we've been going over this for 30 years. How wither the CBC, and I'm done.
Well, Peter, I don't know if that trail is going to end, because I personally think that all this rhetoric from Trump about 51st state, annexing Canada, you're going to find a lot of Canadians rallying around cultural institutions like the CBC and trying to defend them. Them being, it being that we don't have that many cultural institutions, that what we have, we need to protect, this sort of thing. Do you think that sentiment might grow?
No, I don't think it will. I think everybody will say something about it, but everybody still watched the Super Bowl. Everybody still had a Super Bowl party. Nobody has decided, has phoned their cable company and said, can I have a CanCon only package? I'm going to shop Canadian, right? I'm only interested in Canadian cultural institutions. March Madness is coming. That's what will be on all the sports channels, and it'll all be American. USA, USA, USA. I'm a little doomy today, but that's my view.
Let's keep you on the doom beat here, Peter. So you brought up to me this week, what do we call this section? He who shall not be named. You're frustrated from your basement office over in Calgary about what you see as a growing trend of using unnamed sources in pieces. Can you give us a sense of that? And I guess you'd call it sort of sloppy journalism by constantly using unnamed sources rather than the naming names?
Yeah, I called it out because, it's getting sloppier and sloppier. Now, there are times when you need to have anonymous sources, like when the allegations of foreign interference came up, of Chinese influence and that sort of stuff, where you've got people working in security institutions who quite literally could go to jail if their names were revealed. But we also know that you don't see a lot of unnamed sources in things like business coverage. And there's reasons for that, because when you give a name, when you actually have the information sourced, there's a greater level of credibility to it. When you don't give a name, there is a slightly diminished level of credibility to it. And when you don't give a name, the reason for hiding that person's name needs to be that they're facing some sort of peril. That's traditionally the way it was. And you did have your own sources who talked to, but you didn't quote them in the paper. So what I found was, for instance, a couple of examples. There was one in Radio Canada who said there was a story about conservatives thinking about reshaping their messaging because Carney, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it said sources aren't being identified because, quote, they were speaking about internal party matters. What? I mean, what? Seriously? Like, because they were speaking about internal parties matters. And I'll do my, sort of back in the day thing. Back in the day, the editor goes back to that reporter and says, I need a name. I need something on the record. This is too weak. Just because the guy doesn't want his name, we don't fold that easily. Push. I want names on the record here if you can. And
Globe
no
loves to do
evidence
this,
that
Peter.
occurs.
Peter, the Globe loves.
Well, and then there's another.
They say this is one I came across. The Globe is not naming the sources because they were not authorized to speak publicly. I don't know how you get authorized to speak. In one story, I found the word sources 18 times in one Globe story. Tara, what do you make of this? Is it growing? Is it bad?
I notice it too, and I don't like it. I think it does strain the reader a little bit for a bunch of reasons. One, you do wonder about the motives of those who are leaking this, and you wonder about whether the journalist is being manipulated by those who have vested interests and would like to leak certain information. But I think you also have to think about the fact that good journalism is replicable by other journalists. We need to be able to fact check each other and check sources and show the public that what we're getting is the truth, not the spin on the truth. And the truth should be replicable.
Okay, so I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I kind of disagree with you both and it make things spicier. Okay, what if that information coming out is within the public interest and your options are, okay, you put out the story, but you don't name the sources, or the story doesn't come out at all. That the journalist isn't able to find someone to talk on this issue, whether it be about, I don't know, foreign interference or something, I don't know, going wrong within a party, something within government, whistleblowing related. And your options are I either publish this with an unnamed source or it's just not going at all, and people are none the wiser.
I think that's the exception. What we're talking about right now is standard operating procedure.
Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, but I think the default position should always be we want something on the record. And the default position has now become, I know some guy in the PMO and he told me some stuff. And the guy in the PMO, honestly, in politics, when they say they're not authorized to speak on the record, well, they're authorized to speak off the record, right? I mean, these leaks, this is a deliberate attempt in many instances by political operatives on all sides of all around the spectrum to get information out there and to make their opponents look bad and to make themselves look good. And there is an authorized spokesman and there's an unauthorized spokesman. And the easier it is to get the unauthorized, the shakier I think the foundation for your reporting is, because they're just, reporters are asking me to trust them. And here's the deal. People don't trust them.
You're not helping your argument.
So what are you doing, right? Make yourself more trustworthy rather than less.
Yeah. So the Globe addressed this a few years ago. Their public editor came out because people are getting, they've been frustrated about this. And they say confidential sources are critical to reporting in the public interest. To ferret out information governments and companies want to keep secret, but they should not be used casually, and efforts should be made to get the information on record. So, yeah, maybe we're being a bit lazy and we should focus a bit more on getting names.
All I'm asking is that the public editor turn that sentence around so that you start with, don't be lazy and work to get things on the record. And then you end with, but there are times when it is necessary.
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay, let's move to another subtopic here. I call this one, these words, they are a-changin'. Tara, you have kept on your phone Oh, very nerdy, I have to say. A list of words that you've seen quickly be introduced or changed. Vocabulary is quite fluid these days. And in the last few years, uh, journalists have been all too happy to change the way we speak about issues in society. Words are a very powerful way, right? The way in which you frame things and the words you use as journalists, the way you put them in your article, you're sending a message to your readers and doing it. We often use a sort of Bible called a style guide. Most of us journalists use something called the Canadian Press Style Guide, which is updated every 2 years, which kind of tells us this is how you should use this word. This is how you should not use this word. This word's become archaic, etc. Let me give you a taste of what the Canadian Press Style Guide has told us for the last few years. In the latest edition, new sections on sensitive subjects. Quote, don't shy away from calling things what they are. Racist language, racist attitudes, or racist behavior. Warn readers whenever necessary. Okay, so that's just a taste of that. But Tara, give us a taste of the words you've seen being used more and more over the last few years that has you frustrated.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this week because I was preparing for this talk about the CBC. And so I was looking through the annual reports for the ombudsman, and there was something that really stood out from the last annual report. And it was a section called Some Words About Words. And so the ombudsman is talking about the nature of the complaints that, in this case, he had been seeing. And he said that there was a fixation on and outrage over specific words and terms. Time after time, people pointed to the language used by journalists in their reports as an indisputable sign of bias. And that really reminded me of some of the arguments that I had in the newsroom when I was there. I kept this running list of words that I thought we should steer clear of. In general, it was activist language, but also some of it was just language that wasn't immediately clear what we were talking about. So I'm going to give you some of the words from that list. Some of them are phrases. The one that started it off for me was lived experience. I started seeing that in our copy all the time. This was in the early days of that phrase, but it does come from activist circles. And I remember talking to one of the other producers about this and saying, look, this is an activist term. We shouldn't be using it. Their response was, this is really a colloquial term now. Everybody uses it. And so I started talking to people in my life outside of media circles, and nobody understood what it meant. Like, isn't that just experience? Like, what is that? And now, of course, we know lived experience is anecdotal experience. So we don't need to use these fancy activist terms. We could just use plain speaking. Here's some other ones that I'm seeing: a safe space, ally, centering, emotional labor, intersectionality, microaggressions, othering, marginalized,
Racialized, bodies, these are all
amplify,
capitalizing.
spaces, unhoused, settler. These are all terms that come from activist circles and therefore bring political weight with them. If we can find ways to say them that are neutral, that don't have that political baggage, we absolutely should.
This is the thing. So these words come from like a fringe part of society, often in academia. And then what we're doing as journalists is we're taking them and we're inserting them in mainstream. You're taking fringe, making it mainstream. And we're basically telling people that, this is the way that people talk with one another. This is sort of normal.
We're also alienating ourselves from our listeners and viewers, because when you hear somebody talking about bodies in crisis, you don't immediately know what's being discussed.
Peter, would you add any words to that list there?
Yeah, I mean, the couple that come to mind, I think that the word moderate is often misused. So it gets placed on a radical position, which, I mean, you may favor that radical position or you may not favor it. And the issue about trans rights comes up, where somebody who's supportive of the idea of a biological male sharing a changing room with young biological women that's deemed to be the moderate position. And anybody then who opposes that is the immoderate individual. When, like I said, whether you favor that position or not, there's nothing moderate about it. It's a radical change in the way we're living, where our lived experience becomes.
I think what people get frustrated with is how quickly.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, people get frustrated. Like the words we just described, if you told me them, I don't know, 8 years ago, I would say, what are those? It's that they came they came from academia or from left-wing circles, and then suddenly they're in front of me and used in almost everything I read. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, like to Tara's point, journalists should be speaking to people in the language they understand, not trying to teach them a new language so that they will somehow be elevated
Here,
into the spirit of the room. Because it sounds like, your therapist is talking to you when you get most of this information. Like, I mean, like, who decided that the term Aboriginal was inappropriate and had to be replaced with Indigenous?
I think a lot of us have
The words literally mean exactly the same thing.
I think they
Right.
urge that for society to progress, the way in which we discuss society, uh, the words used need to change. And if they're not changing, then we're stationary. So some people feel, and maybe a bunch of them are on the left, that like for there to be forward momentum, for us to be moving forward and making gains and improving, that the words need to improve or change.
sometimes it's not an improvement.
Oh no.
Like, let's sneak the word pregnant people or the phrase pregnant people, which gets flagged in this ombuds report that I just referred to. I don't know any pregnant women who would prefer to be called pregnant people.
Hmm.
And this can get quite extreme on that trajectory. And you saw women in the States being referred to as vulva owners or ovaries haver. No thanks.
Peter, can you tell me, do they ever adopt words from the right, or all the words adopted from the left? Does language from the right often seep in?
No.
No.
It doesn't.
So,
And one of the things that we need to think about in terms of this context is that one of the ways to control society is to control the language. If you control the language, then you have control of the narrative, right? So you get the language first, and then you get the narrative, and once you get the narrative, then anybody who disagrees with it or the language becomes a member of the far right.
yeah.
It's
Well, this is another
fairly
far right.
straightforward.
So the for me, if everything is 10, nothing's a 10. If something is genocidal, if something is far right, pushing up against whatever that, I don't know what comes that you get for far enough right, you hit some sort of boulder or something. The New York Times called Daniel Smith far right a few months ago. So, like, I don't know to make sense of the world, we need to use words that match what we're describing. So, there needs to be some sort of gradient. And if everything's some crazy superlative, and Trump does this too. Everything is a 10 or a 0.
Mhm.
We need to be able to make sense of things using words that describe what we're seeing. Sorry, that's my tiny rant there. I also note that I sent this article to you guys. Like last year, story on CTV on Orange Shirt Day, Canada, Canadians, and Vancouver, as well as BC, in quotation marks, contributing to this narrative and this type of thinking, again, which not many people hold, that Canada is a so-called country or so-called nation. Um, Peter, you and I looked at that article, and we also found that it was funded by what?
That reporter was a local journalism initiative reporter,
Yeah, so that's funded
which
by
is
the
that
federal
for people who don't know, that's a fund that goes through the Department of Heritage that pays, I think, 100% of the reporter's salary.
So I think a lot of Canadians, listen, they'll tolerate this sort of terminology if they're reading, uh, I don't know, some alternative source of media on the left that they aren't necessarily paying for. But when they're seeing it in CTV and CBC, in magazines where, their hard-earned money is going towards, I think, they have the rights to get their backs up. When someone seems to be speaking English, but it seems like a whole other language.
Well, the thing is, like the term racialized, for instance, nobody uses that term. Well, I mean, obviously some people do, but it's a very small percentage. I mean, my doctor is from North Africa. My physio is from West Africa. The woman who gives me when I go for a massage is from East Africa. None of them talk about themselves as being racialized. It's unless, I mean, journalism wonders why it can't connect with people. It's because it's constantly using things like this that disconnect people. And I mean, and so what do? They go to the government to get subsidized to continue doing the wrong thing. It's so crazy.
We just need to listen to our viewing and listening public a little bit more, because if you paid attention, people will correct you when you use these words. Case in point, one time on the podcast recently, um, I used the word positionality, which is an academic word. And someone wrote me immediately and was like, "Why are you talking like that? I don't understand what that word means. It's, I think, from academia. Can you just say perspective?" And yep, you're right.
People should be going through scripts with a big red marker and just scratching it all out and change them, toning down the language. I think it was
Or as long as you guys make sure this is a safe space for me.
Yes, yes. I don't know. I didn't like when you used the word lunch and learn earlier, Tara. So I think you need to eviscerate that from your vocabulary. Okay, one more question on this. Tara, do you think that we'll go back to using old words? Some language has to change, right? Like, we won't say these words here, okay, but like, so, to a certain extent, some needs to change. So language should be updated to a certain extent. Is
Of
that
course
fair to
it
say?
should. Of course it should. It's not about changing language. It's not about evolving language norms. It's about whether or not we use activist speak and academic jargon.
Mhm.
I think it's two separate issues.
It's very important to make that point. But and to my second question, do you think that we'll go back to using some of these words, or are these in the next Canadian Press style guide? Some of the words you mentioned.
Well, I think smart communicators are seeing a trend that is happening. And we see this with politicians, we see this with media. There is a lot of rewards in the public square for speaking frankly and speaking clearly and speaking plainly. That's what we're seeing win right now in the public square. And so I think that trend is going to incentivize people to strip down their language a little bit and just say things a little more clearly.
What do you think, Peter? Are we going back to more greater sense of normalcy?
I think the public is going back. I mean, I think like all movements, things eventually go too far, and they begin to reverse. Sometimes they reverse too far, but I don't see, honestly, don't see any trend in Canada in terms of the language media use changing. I think they're pretty hard boiled about it. I think they're pretty dug in, and as long as somebody's going to keep subsidizing you to keep doing things badly, they will continue. If somebody were to take the subsidies away and their primary interest would be in serving the reader, listener, and viewer, then things would have to change or they would die. And there's nothing like a hanging to focus your mind.
Talk about morbid. Oh my gosh, Peter. Get your views on this, guys. Like, I think, we talk about pendulum swinging and things are changing and people are learning their lessons, etc. My view is that for institutions that are pretty captured by this ideology, whether they be academia and journalism, where a lot of people believe firmly in this stuff, and they would attach these words to human rights, and they don't see any problem with this. They see this completely as progress. It's it's going to take quite a while for the pendulum to swing within those institutions. They will be the last place where the pendulum swings, because just naturally, as we've talked about on this podcast before, most people that get into these industries in academia and journalism are of the left. So, the retreat will occur there last. Is that fair to say, Tara?
I think that's very fair to say. I think this stuff has been very institutionalized. I mean, if you look at job postings, if you look at internal documents, it's all in this language and it's this ideology for sure. I will say, though, I mean, I know a lot of people on the left who are also very sick of all this and very fed up with it, too. I think what we're waiting for is that preference cascade, to use another
Oh my God.
jargon. But there's been a lot of people kind of going along with this stuff to get along with it. And because the stakes have been high, too. Like, look, you could lose your livelihood if you said the wrong thing. I think there's been a lot of people just kind of going along. And the second that they have social permission to publicly object on this stuff, they will. We're just waiting for that precipitating event. And to Peter's point, I think the danger is that the backlash goes too far. And I don't want to see that happen either. I think it's better for us to start speaking about these things openly now, have an honest debate, have a good faith debate about it, as opposed to waiting until it bubbles over in rage and we get a backlash that takes us like back in history in ways that we do not want to go.
Peter, do you want to go back in history?
Yes, sometimes. But I don't think I agree with Tara in terms of that. Like, yeah, I'd like to go back to when I was 35. That was good. But no, the institutions, some of these are baked in. People don't realize they're not using the language of working men and women, to use an old fashioned phrase, ordinary people, because the group they hang out with all uses that language, right? Like if you sit around in a faculty lounge, you have no idea. And lots of institutions have their own languages. I mean, I when I was at the CRTC, you could sit in a room full of telecom people, and you would have no idea what they're talking about, because they have their own language, right? And their own series of acronyms and that sort of stuff. It becomes impenetrable. People in that universe understand everything, but outside of it, they don't. So no, I don't see it going back, because they're all these journalists, they're all coming out of academia, and they're speaking the language of the faculty lounge.
The thing is, if you're serving the public, you should speak like the public. Let's bookend it with that. Okay, just before we let you go,
What do they know?
just before we go, we're gonna do our segment we do on the tail end of the show, where we deliver a bouquet to a journalist or a group of journalists we think are actually doing their jobs. I have the honor of delivering the daffodils this week. And I'm going to go across the border. You know, these Americans have been pretty cruel to us in the last few days, but I'm going to extend what, flower branch? Anyway, I'm going to give the flowers to PBS Frontline. They've been around for 42 seasons. It's run out of PBS, which is an American public broadcaster. Since 1988, they've aired a documentary called The Choice. They do a lot of current affairs, a lot of documentaries, where they profile the various candidates for the presidential election. It's very informative. It's very in-depth. And then afterwards, they look back to focus on the person who won. In this case, they did a documentary called Comeback. It's their first episode in 2025, talks about Trump's comeback. And the reason why I'm talking about these guys is because I think they do a good job of speaking to all sides. They talk to a ton of people on Trump's side. They talk to a ton of people on the Democratic side and in media, etc. They also then air unedited interviews of these interviews that then make up the documentary. And they put out the transcripts as well. So they're being honest. Remember, there's a lot of debate around this when it comes to CBS and the 60 Minutes interview with Trump and over-editing, etc. Anyway, Tara, you don't agree with me that you're holding back these flowers from being delivered. Why is that the case?
I agree with you that it's wonderful practice to release the unedited interviews. I think that's great. I think they missed the story. I think they were so focused on Trump's psychology and on his biography and trying to figure out why Trump is such a winner, essentially, was the thesis of the documentary. Why does he keep winning? I think they missed the voters' perspective. I didn't see any evidence that they had consulted the voters. And if you speak to Trump voters, which I have, what you're going to hear is very different. And we heard it actually this week, Harrison, when we went to see Oren Cass speak from American Compass, which is some of the policy framework around what we're seeing from Trump. Trump's not a huge policy guy, but there is a big framework behind him. And what we heard from Oren Cass is, look, the last 30 years have been years of American decline. And for young people coming up, we're seeing a housing crisis, we're seeing an opioid crisis, we're seeing forever wars that have been unsuccessful and that have cost a lot in terms of human life, but also morale. And we're seeing the economic structure has been very good for the winners of neoliberal economics. It has not been great for the middle class, and it's been terrible for the working class. And that's the perspective that you are hearing. And on top of all of that, the winners have extended enormous amounts of scorn to the lower middle class and to the working class in the United States. Donald Trump is saying to those people, I'm going to change it. I'm going to change it on a policy level. The tariffs represent that, even though we in Canada do not like it at all. And he's also saying to them, I like you. I'm with you. That's a pretty powerful message when you have had the kind of scorn that we've seen in the American press in recent years towards the working class. I think that's the story they missed, and if they'd talked to voters, I think they would have got it.
Well, this is the thing. There's actually a show that The Guardian does called Anywhere But Washington. And getting out of the capital cities, they have another show where I think it's Anywhere But Westminster, and like talking to people in towns and going up to the street and interacting with them on a human level, I think is fairly, it's fair to say something that was missing from that doc. Peter, what did you think about it?
I didn't watch it, and I'm somewhat
Doing your homework.
suspicious of you for having watched it. No, I don't watch cable, and I don't watch. I watch very little American news. It just not of that much interest to me because there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. And I feel badly enough about what my generation has turned Canada into. I don't want to get more depressed by turning over there. But I think the idea of releasing the unedited interviews is a great idea. I mean, that sort of transparency, I think, really helps add credibility to journalism. So for those of you who are big, watch American public television, I think you've made a wise choice in handing out that bouquet for that reason alone, notwithstanding Tara's objection. So I'm working hard here to agree with both of you, so you'll be nice to me.
That's okay. We're going to be nice to you regardless. It's a steep hill to climb for us journalists to gain back the trust of the public, but we will do our best. And we'd like to thank all of you for joining us this week on Full Press. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.